That was a huge, huge, huge light bulb moment to us. We published a major paper on that in a major journal. And that really was a wake up call for all of us people who'd been studying all these creatures and just assuming they simply by instinct do what they do.
Fred, your research program focused on nutritional wisdom of the body, the nutritional wisdom of the body. Scientists and practitioners in food, nutrition, pharmaceutical, and the medical industries rarely ever talk about this topic, nor do people in the general population know what it is. So, what is nutritional wisdom, and do livestock and humans both possess this natural ability for nutritional wisdom?
That's a wonderful place, I think, to launch into the conversation, Paul, and to set up a background that'll link my experience in that with the questions that you have. Um, if you think about it, I mentioned my fascination with wild creatures. If you think about it, nobody has to tell a bacteria, wild insect, fish, bird, or mammal how to eat, how to develop, how to replicate. Um, they know how to do that. How do they do that then is a question. The domestic animals, goats, sheep, and cattle that I had no background of until I got on the ranch and came to be really fascinated with. You look at them foraging, and you may look at an old cow in the pasture and think that's a pretty easy life, right out there in the green grass, and there can't be much going on here. A person asked me recently, "Do they have any intelligence?" And it was person didn't know about my background or anything, and I it was nice and stuff. But what we got into, and this may sound like details, but it was it became fascinating to me, is that these animals are challenged to select diets from literally hundreds of different plant species. So imagine that you're out there on a landscape and you've got to forage for yourself. Like you guys are pretty independent on your place. We were on the ranch and we try to be still now, but imagine you've got to do that like our ancestors did back in the day. And you've got all these different grasses, forbs, shrubs, trees, each unique phytochemically. Some of these species and plant parts are highly nutritious, but others are deadly toxic.
Yeah.
Individual plants can be nutritious or toxic depending on the time of day, the season of the year, and so forth, and the resources available in the environment. So it's really a moving target. And yet, even with domestic animals, we came to find out and to really appreciate that they know what and what not to eat. Now, consider the irony. I think of this all the time. People have to be told by authority figures constantly what and what not to eat. So, the question that I raised in nourishment was, have we lost the ability to identify and select nourishing diets, or has that ability been hijacked? And
Yes.
if it has been hijacked, how did that happen?
Yeah, that's for very good investigation to dialogue about here.
Yeah, and as we go along, I know we're going to get into that more and more. So let me say a few more words about this whole idea of nutritional wisdom to give the listeners just a little bit of sense of what that is. So the question is, how do animals meet needs for nutrients and medicines? How do they self-medicate in the absence of nutritionists, pharmacists, medical doctors, and so forth? And I'm not in anything I say, I'm not trying to berate any of those professions or anything like that. I'm just raising points of food for thought kinds of issues. So if you'll indulge me a minute, I'll tell you two stories here
Yeah,
that
please do.
when I got to graduate school, my idea, so I was fascinated not only by wild creatures, but also as a result of my education at Colorado State University, became absolutely enthralled with plants, different plant species, and the diversity of different plant species. And I want to make points about that as we go along. Um, you know, we raise lawns and the extravagant use of resources. If we were to get back into native plants and the beauty of native plants, wild grasses, forbs, and shrubs, there's a lot to be said for that. We can come to that later on. But I became, you know, my mother had raised gardens while I was growing up, vegetable gardens. She loved flower gardens. So I had been exposed to that, but I had never really seen a plant until the sophomore year in college when I took plant taxonomy. And we had to go out and do a collection of plants. And it was just like this whole world. I couldn't believe I had to read 2 books just to learn how to identify plants, all their different parts of the plants and so
Yeah.
forth. And it just opened up a world to me I'd never seen. I often say, I'm digressing just a second, I'm coming back, but I often say, growing up, there were only 3 seasons for me: hunting, fishing, and skiing. And I survived the end of one season only because the next season was coming around. So I got out of school that sophomore year, went back to work on the ranch, and I went to fish a small stream that I loved to fish since I was a tiny kid. And I could no longer fish that stream because I was so enthralled by the plants that I'd never seen,
Wow.
universes that were there. And it struck me and still does to this day. How many universes don't we see that are right there in front of us? But it was just alive. So, anyway, what I would have liked to study in graduate school is wild goats, mountain goats, foraging on high elevation rangelands in the Rocky Mountains. That would have been my idea of a ideal research project, is following them around, seeing what they're eating, trying to just do that. Well, I ended up with a project that was studying domestic goats down in southern Utah by a town called St. George, about 28 miles northwest of St. George in the mountains there. So I thought, what can be more boring than that? But there was funding for that research project, you know. And the idea was what we mentioned earlier, was can we use domestic goats to prune this shrub blackbrush that grows in monocultures across huge areas of the transition zone between the cold and hot deserts. Can we use domestic goats to prune that shrub during the winter, stimulate new growth? New twigs grow in the spring. Does that make sense? And these new twigs, people had done assays and they showed they're higher in energy, protein, and minerals than the old woody twig growth. So we knew wildlife wintered on those landscapes, and we thought we could use goats to improve those landscapes for mule deer, bighorn sheep, and for cattle that wintered in those areas. So that was the idea behind the project. Now, 2 stories that I want to tell about that whole business. The first is that what we quickly discovered as we got into the study was that given a choice, most goats, and I make a point of this, not all goats, but 80 to 90% of the goats didn't want anything to do with the new twigs on blackbrush. They very strongly preferred the old woody twigs.
Hmm.
When I told a toxicologist, an old toxicologist at Utah State about that, he looked at me and he said, I guess that just goes to prove that domestic animals have lost nutritional wisdom.
Wow.
And I didn't believe him, but I say that because that was the belief in those times, is that wild species still had it, but as a result of 10,000 years of domestication, domestic animals had lost that ability. So I didn't know what to say. I didn't believe him, but at that time, and this will lead into some of the questions that are coming up at that time, roughly what, 50 years ago, 40 years ago, this whole area that I'll refer to as plant chemical ecology was just getting a start, where ecologists were starting to look at the diverse arrays of compounds that plants produce. You know, up to that time, people had focused on energy, protein, minerals, vitamins, but there was this huge array of other compounds that plants produce. We don't need to get into the details on that in this podcast, I don't think, but they come under broad headings such as phenolics, which there'll be tens of thousands of those, terpenes, same thing, alkaloids, and so on and so forth. So there's tremendous diversity. And years ago, people thought they were simply waste products of plant metabolism. In other words, sort of the urine and feces of plants. Well, it came at the time that I got involved in all of this and the ecologists were getting involved, they were referred to as secondary compounds.
Right.
And you're familiar with that term and all of that sort of thing. So
Royal Lee calls them nutritional cofactors.
yes, another way to talk about and think about them, and important recognizing that they play roles. So this whole field was burgeoning then, and we had this issue with the goats not wanting to eat the new twigs of blackbrush. And I met some people at the University of Alaska, some ecologists, some plant herbivore ecologists like myself, as well as natural products chemists. And we got to talking and thinking, this is probably being chemically mediated. And at that time, what people did was so called bioassays, where you'd work with natural products chemists and you'd extract compounds from plants and then you'd put them on chow of what alfalfa pellets, let's just say, and you'd see whether or not those compounds deterred feeding by animals. And the chemists had really, I'd say, very nice procedures for thinking about how do we fractionate these plants and how do we make what can be incredibly challenging kind of issue doable. So we started working with these chemists. We would harvest lots of blackbrush twigs, new twigs. It's great labor, actually, huge work to do that. And then we'd grind, extract, purify compounds from them. And we'd done a series of bioassays with nothing deterring the goats. We finally came to one last compound, a particular condensed tannin that was in blackbrush. And our friend, the chemist, said, this about got to be it. I don't know what else is in this plant. So we did the feeding trial. I'll never forget. It was in the dead of winter, and I'll say that this purified tannin was worth more than gold to us. It takes a lot of time to extract and purify. So we put this on the chow. We had 24 goats on the trial. Every goat ate every pellet. And we're thinking, what the heck is going on with this deal? Our friend Tom Clausen tells us this is the only compound that's left in this plant that can be deterrent. And we probably spent an hour there after we fed that, just trying to think what to do. And we said, well, the only thing we can do is take the tannin that's left and run one more trial tomorrow and see what happens. Ran the trial that next day. Not a goat ate a pellet.
Interesting.
That was a huge light bulb moment to us, a huge light bulb moment, because it taught us, one, that condensed tannin was deterrent, but much more importantly than that, the goats were learning to avoid the twigs. They didn't innately know. And that shifted. We published a major paper on that in a major journal. And that really was a wake-up call for all of us people who'd been studying all these creatures and just assuming they simply by instinct do what they do. It was like, no, learning is probably really important. And I'll have to say that I made some friends in the world of psychology as a result of publishing that paper.